You can't keep that boat here." Those words hit me like a slap across the face that morning. I was standing by my dock, polishing the side of my small fishing boat, breathing in the fresh scent of lake water, enjoying the peace of my cabin, when I suddenly found myself surrounded by 3 HOA board members marching down like they were generals inspecting an army. Leading the charge was the infamous woman everyone in the neighborhood called Karen. She wasn't just the type to complain about everything, she lived for it. If a bird landed on the wrong tree, she'd file a complaint. If a neighbor painted their door slightly off the approved shade of beige, she'd threaten fines. And now, apparently, my boat had become her latest target. Karen pointed at my boat like it was a piece of toxic waste. According to HOA regulations, she announced in her shrill, bossy tone, no private boats can dock here unless they've been approved and registered with the association. Your boat has no approval. That means it needs to go. The 2 men behind her, who clearly acted like her backup, nodded along as if her word was the law of the land. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. This dock is on my property. This boat is mine. Your rules don't apply here, I said firmly, looking her in the eye. But Karen wasn't one to back down. She quickly pulled a stack of crumpled papers from her handbag, flipping through them dramatically like she was about to reveal some grand law from the Constitution. "Right here," she said, jabbing a finger at the page, "the HOA has jurisdiction over all waterfront properties. That includes docks and boats. If you don't comply, you'll be fined $500 per day until this violation is corrected. And if you refuse, we'll tow it away." She spoke like she was handing down a royal decree. For a second, I almost laughed. The absurdity of it all was so ridiculous. "With all due respect," I replied, "you don't own the lake. You don't own my dock. And you sure don't own my boat. You can't just make up rules and expect me to bow down to them." But Karen smirked, clearly enjoying the little display of power she thought she had. "We'll see about that," she snapped before turning sharply on her heels, her 2 followers trailing after her like obedient guard dogs. I thought that would be the end of it. Surely, they were bluffing. After all, I had bought this cabin specifically because it came with private lake access and a dock. That was the whole point, to have my own space away from people telling me what to do. But 2 days later, when I came home from work, I found a bright orange notice nailed right into one of the wooden posts of my dock. In bold letters, it read, "HOA violation, remove boat immediately or face daily fines." My jaw dropped. They had actually gone through with it. Standing there on my dock, staring at that notice flapping in the breeze, my blood began to boil. These people had no right. No legal standing. No ownership of the water, the dock, or the property. Yet they strutted around acting like tyrants, inventing rules and punishing anyone who dared to live outside their little bubble of control. I pulled the notice off, crumpled it in my fist, and tossed it into the trash. My first instinct was to storm over to Karen's house and demand answers. But something inside me said that wouldn't work. People like her fed off confrontation. They loved the drama, the chance to stand on their soapbox and preach about their authority. Instead, I sat down at my desk that night and started researching. I pulled up county property maps, zoning laws, HOA charters, anything I could get my hands on. And guess what I found? I was right. The HOA's authority ended where my property line began. The lake was public water, overseen by the county, not by them. My dock was privately owned, completely outside their jurisdiction. Which meant all their threats, all their notices, all their so-called rules, were nothing but empty noise. But I knew one thing for sure, this wasn't going to stop. If I let them win this battle, they'd come after something else next. My cabin's paint color, my fence, even the flowers I planted. That's what HOAs like this did, they fed on control until you either broke or fought back. As I leaned back in my chair that night, staring at the pile of papers I'd gathered, a thought crossed my mind. I could fight them legally, dragging them to court and proving they had no power. But lawsuits take time, and HOAs always drag them out, knowing most people eventually give up. That wasn't me. I wanted something faster. Something stronger. Something that would make them regret ever trying to push me around. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee and looked out across the lake, my eyes landed on the marina on the far side of the water. Dozens of shiny boats lined up neatly in slips, most of them owned by the very same HOA members who were trying to bully me. Suddenly, the spark of an idea flickered in my mind. A crazy, impossible idea. But the longer I thought about it, the more it made sense. The HOA wanted to control me through my boat. What if I flipped the script and controlled them through theirs? That's when I made my decision. I wouldn't just fight back, I'd outsmart them in a way they never saw coming. And it all started with that marina. I didn't waste a second after that night of research. The orange violation notice had been my wake-up call, and if the HOA thought they could bully me into submission, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Instead of sitting around drafting angry letters back and forth, I drove straight to the county office the next morning. I wanted to confirm everything I suspected, that the HOA had absolutely zero legal control over the water. I sat across from a clerk at the county zoning department and asked point-blank, "Does the HOA have any ownership or jurisdiction over the lake?" The woman looked at me like I had asked whether the sun rose in the east. "Of course not," she said. "That's county-regulated water. It's public access. They can't enforce rules outside their own property boundaries." Exactly what I thought. That meant every threat they had thrown my way was built on sand. But here's the thing, just proving them wrong wasn't enough for me anymore. They had hammered that violation notice into my dock, nailed it into the wood like they were branding their authority onto my property. They wanted a fight, and I was more than ready to give them one. As I was leaving the county building, my truck facing the lake in the distance, that crazy idea returned to me. The marina. Every time I drove past it, I saw it packed with glossy speedboats, gleaming yachts, and little weekend cruisers. Most of them belonged to the same HOA members who strutted around the neighborhood acting superior. It was their playground, their trophy case, their symbol of status. Without the marina, they had nothing but a lake they couldn't properly use. And that's when it hit me, what if I bought it? What if I owned the one thing that kept their little empire afloat? It sounded insane at first. I mean, who just buys a marina? But the more I thought about it, the more possible it became. So I made a few calls. Within hours, I was sitting in the office of a local real estate agent, asking about the property. To my surprise, her face lit up. "Oh, the marina," she said. "The current owner has been trying to sell it for months. HOA complaints, maintenance headaches, lawsuits, you name it. He's exhausted. You might be just the person he's looking for." My pulse quickened. I asked her to set up a meeting, and 2 days later I was shaking hands with the marina's owner, an older gentleman named Frank who looked like he hadn't had a peaceful day since the HOA moved in. We sat in his small office overlooking the docks, sipping coffee while he vented about the endless interference from Karen and her board. "They want the docks painted a certain color, they complain about boat sizes, they harass my staff about noise levels," he said, rubbing his temples. "Owning this place used to be a dream. Now it's a nightmare." I leaned forward and asked the question that had been burning in my mind. "Would you sell it?" Frank blinked, almost in disbelief. "You're serious?" When I nodded, he broke into the first genuine smile I'd seen on his face. "Son, if you make me a fair offer, I'll hand you the keys today." We negotiated right there on the spot. The price was steep, but I had saved for years and I saw this not as a purchase, but as an investment, and a weapon. Within a week, the paperwork was signed. Just like that, I became the proud owner of the very marina that the HOA depended on for their boating lifestyle. The day I took over, I walked the dock slowly, letting the reality sink in. Row after row of sleek, expensive boats rested quietly in their slips. Every single one of them was at my mercy now. The HOA board members might not have respected my property rights, but they couldn't escape the fact that I now controlled theirs. The delicious irony wasn't lost on me. Here they were, fining me and threatening to tow away my modest little fishing boat, while their luxury toys were tied up on docks I now owned. They wanted to push me around with paperwork and threats. I was about to push back with something much stronger, ownership. But I didn't act immediately. Instead, I waited. Sure enough, within days another letter from the HOA appeared in my mailbox. This time they claimed I owed $1,500 in accumulated fines and warned me that my boat would be forcibly removed within the week. I framed that letter and hung it on my cabin wall, a trophy of their arrogance. Then I got to work drafting my own notice. On official Marina letterhead, in bold print, I wrote, effective immediately, all HOA members are prohibited from docking, storing, or accessing boats at this marina. You have 14 days to remove your vessels. Any boats remaining after that period will be considered abandoned property and subject to removal. I had copies printed, laminated, and posted on every single slip at the marina. I made sure they were impossible to miss, fluttering in the wind right above their precious boats. I even mailed copies directly to the HOA board, just to make it official. I'll never forget the feeling of walking down those docks, hammering the notices into place while imagining the chaos that was about to unfold. For years, the HOA had lorded their rules over everyone, convinced no one could touch them. And now, one stubborn boat owner had just pulled the rug out from under them. It wasn't just revenge, it was poetic justice. The fallout started almost instantly. Within 24 hours, my phone was buzzing non-stop with angry calls. One board member left a screaming voicemail threatening to sue me into bankruptcy. Another demanded a private meeting, insisting that community harmony depended on me rescinding the ban. Karen, of course, was the loudest. She left me 5 voicemails in a row, each more hysterical than the last, ending with, "You're ruining this entire neighborhood, and I will personally make sure you regret this." I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I sat back on my porch with a cold drink, listening to the angry chorus, smiling as the sun set over the lake. The beauty of it all was that I didn't need to fight them in court, I didn't need to scream or threaten, I had the law and the property rights on my side. They couldn't touch me. They couldn't fine me. They couldn't force me to give them access. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted, and they were the ones on the outside looking in. And as the 14-day deadline loomed closer, I could already imagine the sight of them scrambling, trying to figure out where to park their shiny toys now that their golden dock had slipped right through their fingers. The storm that followed was unlike anything I had ever seen. The very next HOA board meeting turned into a circus. I didn't even need to attend to know what was happening. The entire neighborhood buzzed with whispers, and within hours, I started receiving texts from neighbors saying, they're losing their minds over the marina. Apparently, half the board was shouting at each other, the other half was shouting about me, and Karen was at the center of it all, red-faced, waving her arms like she was conducting an orchestra of chaos. By the time the meeting was over, the HOA had already tried drafting an emergency motion to reverse my decision, which was laughable because they had no jurisdiction over my marina. They were playing make-believe law, and everyone knew it. That night, my phone lit up with a barrage of angry calls. Some were from HOA board members, others from boat owners who'd been blindsided by the ban. One particularly furious man left a voicemail saying, "You don't know who you're messing with. We'll take you down in court, you little punk." I saved that message and played it back later while laughing, because what none of them understood was this: I hadn't done anything illegal. I had bought the marina fair and square, and I had every right to decide who docked there. They were used to intimidation and threats working on regular homeowners, but I wasn't just a homeowner anymore, I was their landlord. The first few days after the notices went up were filled with denial. Some HOA members ripped the notices down from their boat slips, thinking they could ignore me. I simply walked the docks the next morning and replaced them with fresh copies, this time stapled in 3 different spots so they couldn't just yank them off. Others tried sneaking their boats out after hours, parking them along the public shoreline. That didn't last long. The county sheriff's office got involved when someone complained about illegally parked vessels blocking public access. Within days, deputies were ticketing HOA members left and right, forcing them to move their boats or face fines from the county. Watching them get hit with actual legal consequences while I sat back untouched was almost too satisfying. But the real fireworks happened when Karen herself decided to confront me. One Saturday morning, just as I was sipping my coffee on the porch, I heard the sound of high heels clacking down my dock. Sure enough, there she was, storming toward me like a bull charging a red cape. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she spat, jabbing a finger at me. "You're destroying this community. You're tearing neighbors apart. You can't ban us from the marina. We've used it for years, it's tradition." I calmly set my coffee down and stood up, letting her rant. When she finally paused for air, I smiled and said, "Karen, I don't care about your traditions. I care about my rights. You came after me, you nailed a violation notice into my dock, you threatened my property. So I bought the one thing you can't live without. That's called business. That's called winning." Her face turned crimson. "We'll sue you. We'll sue you until you're bankrupt," she screamed. I tilted my head, pretending to think it over, then replied, "Go ahead. The judge will laugh you out of court just like the county clerk laughed when you claimed you own the lake. You can't win. You've already lost." She had no comeback for that. She stormed off, her heels clicking furiously against the wood, muttering curses under her breath. I sat back down, took another sip of coffee, and watched her stomp up the road like a toddler throwing a tantrum. The days ticked by, and as the 14-day deadline loomed closer, panic set in among the HOA members. They started scrambling for alternatives, calling every marina within 50 miles. The problem? Those marinas were already full, and the few spots that were available cost 3 times as much as what they'd been paying me. I heard through the grapevine that some families had to drive nearly an hour just to launch their boats for a weekend trip. Others, too embarrassed to admit defeat, sold their boats outright. Suddenly, the lake that used to be buzzing with HOA speedboats and jet skis grew quieter. The fishermen and families I'd welcomed back to my marina had the water almost to themselves again, and the peace that returned to the lake was something I hadn't realized I'd been missing until it was back. One afternoon, I was down at the marina chatting with a local father and his son, who were loading up their little aluminum fishing boat. They told me, "We haven't been able to use the lake in years. The HOA pushed us out, made it impossible for us to afford a slip. You giving us space again means the world to us." That moment right there reminded me why I had done this. It wasn't just about revenge, although that part felt pretty sweet. It was about balance. It was about standing up to bullies and giving regular people a chance to enjoy the lake without being strangled by rules and fines. But of course, the HOA wasn't about to let their pride go so easily. By the end of the 2 weeks, instead of moving their boats, several members left them docked in protest, daring me to enforce my notice. That was the moment I'd been waiting for. With my marina manager by my side, I called in a towing company that specialized in marine vessels. On the morning of the deadline, the tow crew showed up with cranes and flatbed trailers, ready to haul away any abandoned boats. HOA members rushed down to the docks, shouting and waving their arms, trying to block the crew from working. But legally, the boats were trespassing. The sheriff's deputies I had on standby made sure no one interfered. By noon, 3 boats had already been hauled away, and the rest of the owners caved, rushing to get their vessels out before they lost them entirely. It was a scene I'll never forget, wealthy HOA members, red-faced and panicked, scrambling like ants while deputies kept the peace and my tow crew did their job. Some of them were crying, some were screaming, and Karen herself stood on the sidelines shrieking threats at me the entire time. But I didn't flinch. I stood tall, hands in my pockets, watching as the very people who had tried to control me were forced to face the consequences of their arrogance. By the end of the week, the marina was empty of every HOA-owned boat. For the first time in years, it wasn't cluttered with luxury toys belonging to people who thought they owned the world. Instead, it was filled with laughter from local families, fishermen casting lines, and kids jumping off docks. It had become what it should have been all along, a place for the community, not a symbol of power for the HOA. And the board members who once strutted around, barking orders and waving violation notices, now found themselves powerless, outsmarted, and out of options. What they didn't realize yet was that their nightmare was only beginning. Because once word spread about what had happened, their precious reputation as a prestigious community would start to crumble. And I was more than ready to watch the fall. By the time the marina had been cleared of the HOA's boats, the community was in full-blown meltdown. For years, the HOA had strutted around as if they were kings and queens of the lake, handing out fines, barking orders, and threatening anyone who dared step out of line. But now, for the first time, the power wasn't in their hands anymore, it was in mine. And they hated it. They weren't just angry. They were humiliated. Their members had spent thousands maintaining boats they could no longer use, they had been forced to haul them miles away, and some had even sold them for pennies on the dollar just to escape the embarrassment. To me, it was simple justice. To them, it was war. And war is exactly what they declared. It started with a formal complaint filed at the county office, claiming that my ownership of the marina was a direct threat to community harmony. I couldn't help but laugh when I got the letter from the county clerk letting me know about the complaint. The words, community harmony, sounded like something straight out of Karen's mouth. Sure enough, when I showed up at the hearing, there she was, front and center, flanked by her loyal board members. She launched into a dramatic speech about how the HOA had a long-standing right to the marina, how I was unfairly punishing innocent families, and how my actions were destroying property values. She almost had tears in her eyes as she painted me as some kind of villain. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up slowly, held up the deed to the marina, and simply said, "This is mine. I bought it legally. Their HOA rules don't apply here." End of story. The county official glanced at the papers, nodded, and dismissed the complaint in less than 5 minutes. Karen's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. The other board members started whispering angrily among themselves, realizing they just lost another battle. I walked out of that room with my head held high, leaving them fuming in their seats. But they weren't done. A few weeks later, I was served with a lawsuit. The HOA was suing me, demanding restoration of community access rights to the marina. They threw every legal term they could find into the paperwork, clearly hoping to overwhelm me. But what they didn't expect was that I had already hired a sharp attorney who specialized in property law. When the case went to court, the HOA's argument fell apart almost immediately. The judge listened to their claims for about 10 minutes before cutting them off. "You don't own the marina. You don't have an easement. You don't even have standing," he said flatly. "This lawsuit is dismissed." Just like that, their big legal threat evaporated. The board walked out of that courtroom looking like they'd been hit by a truck. Their members were furious too, because not only had they lost, but they had blown through thousands of dollars in HOA funds trying to fight me. Suddenly, neighbors who once obeyed Karen like she was royalty were questioning her leadership. Whispers spread at community barbecues and mailbox clusters. Why did she spend so much of our money on this? Why didn't she know the marina was private? Maybe it's time for new board members. The once tight grip of the HOA was loosening, and I had been the one to pry their fingers off the handle. Meanwhile, I was thriving. The marina, once clogged with luxury toys, was now open to the people who had been excluded for years. I renamed it Freedom Dock, put up a new sign at the entrance, and started renting slips at reasonable rates to locals who had long been pushed out by the HOA's arrogance. Families who had been priced out finally had a place to launch their fishing boats. Kids were back on the docks, laughing and cannonballing into the water. Older couples came down to sit in lawn chairs and watch the sunsets. It became a place of community again, not the gated, exclusive playground the HOA had tried to turn it into, but something real, something alive. And the money? Business boomed. With steady rentals, weekend events, and even small fishing tournaments, the marina started pulling in profits. Within a year, I had made back every penny I'd spent on the purchase. The irony was almost too good. While the HOA drained its funds fighting a losing battle, I was turning their former stronghold into the most successful investment I had ever made. Karen, of course, couldn't let it go. She showed up at the marina one afternoon, standing at the gates with a small group of bored loyalists, holding protest signs that said things like, "Restore our rights," and "Community over greed." I watched them from my office window, sipping coffee as they chanted to passing cars. The thing is, no one cared. Drivers honked, but not in support, in mockery. Locals laughed as they passed, shaking their heads at the ridiculousness of it all. The protest fizzled out in less than 2 hours. Defeated, Karen threw her sign into a trash can and stormed off, her followers trailing behind like embarrassed children. The longer this dragged on, the more cracks appeared in the HOA's empire. Members started resigning from the board. Families moved away, tired of the drama and the wasted money. The once feared HOA that had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist had turned into a joke. And every time I walked down to my dock, climbed into my little fishing boat, and pushed out onto the water, I smiled. I had won. But the best part wasn't just that I had beaten them. The best part was the peace that returned to my life. No more orange violation notices nailed to my dock. No more angry phone calls. No more threats about rules that didn't apply to me. Instead, I had a thriving marina, a quiet cabin, and the freedom to enjoy the lake exactly how I wanted. And every time I passed by the empty shoreline where Karen's boat used to sit, I felt a surge of satisfaction. She had nothing left, no boat, no dock, no control. People often ask me if I regret how far I took things. Did I really need to buy the marina? Did I really need to ban them all? And my answer is always the same, yes. Because sometimes, the only way to stop a bully is to show them just how powerless they really are. The HOA thought they could dictate every aspect of my life. They thought they could fine me into submission. They thought they could intimidate me. But they forgot one thing: people like me don't back down. People like me find another way to fight. So if you ever find yourself being pushed around by an HOA, or anyone who thinks they can control you just because they've got a little bit of power, remember my story. Sometimes the best revenge isn't yelling or arguing or even going to court. Sometimes the best revenge is outsmarting them so completely that they never see it coming. They ordered me to remove my boat. Instead, I bought their marina and removed their power. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat.